I'm Christian Wolmar, and welcome to Calling All Stations, the podcast that brings you all the latest news on transport issues. And with me is Mark Walker of Cogitamus. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Christian. Our podcast today is principally contains an interview that you have secured, a rare and very insightful interview with Anit Chandarana, who is lead director for the Great British Railways transition team. And Anit has been talking to you about the work of GBRTT, the rail reform programme, and the prospects for legislation to implement the Williams-Shapps Plan for rail.
So on this podcast, we like to interview leading transport figures, and I thought that it would be very interesting to hear what is happening at Great British Railways transition team. And so with me is the lead director, Anit Chandarana, who has agreed to speak to us about progress at GBRTT and what is needed. So let's just start, Anit, by saying, just give me a little bit of history about this, because I think this was the name particularly is a bit of Boris Johnson, so it obviously stretches some way back.
Yeah, no, sure. And thank you, Christian, for the opportunity to talk on it. So, yes, this does stretch some way back. It starts with some really difficult period of time in the railways history, with particularly the May 2018 timetable collapse. And at that point, the then Secretary of State, Chris Grayling, it really dawned on him how the industry didn't have a way of coming together naturally in the way that it was organised. And so he commissioned Keith Williams to do what became the Williams Review, and then ultimately the Williams-Shapps White Paper. And the fundamentals that Keith found was absolutely what Chris Grayling was seeing, was that ultimately all roads led to the Secretary of State. That's really where the industry came together, and that it doesn't matter how well-intentioned people were in the industry, and Keith was very clear that he did see a lot of people who were well-intentioned, good, clever people. They were working to different incentives and different objectives, and doing what rational people do, which is work hard to achieve those objectives. But when you added all of those objectives together, they didn't provide a rational outcome for the industry as a whole. And of course, Christian, you recognise that for a while now in some of your work, that we were not delivering for customers, and by customers, let's be really clear, we mean passengers and we mean freight users. Those are the customers, and that we weren't delivering for the funders either as a consequence of
this really came about because of the May 2018 timetable debate, which highlighted this, wasn't it?
Yeah, correct. And so that's really where, and one of the key recommendations Keith had in his work was to create something he called this guiding mind, where we brought the industry together, fundamentally bringing parts of DFT, RDG, Network Rail under common leadership, and then that would give us a better ability to take rational decisions across the system. I remember he explained it really clearly to us when he was speaking about it. He said what he found in the industry was one where our biggest revenue decisions were taken in one part of the industry, and our biggest cost decisions were taken in another part of the industry, and no reasonable organisation setting itself up for success would separate those big decisions in that way. And this is really about bringing that together and making those decisions in a joined up way.
Okay, so how are you going about that? Because it is difficult. We've seen it for a long time. This structure has existed really for 25 years of franchising out. And then we had COVID, which kind of provided a rather kick to the system. Indeed. So how are you going to go about bringing it more together?
Yeah, it's a couple of features in that. So first of all, we do absolutely need legislation to bring it together in a sustainable way, and the legislation is ready, and it's been reviewed, and some of your listeners will have heard Mark Harper talk about it at the Bradshaw lecture. So he and the team at DFT are pushing to get that legislation in the fourth session of Parliament, so before a general election, which would be our ideal scenario. Indeed, ideally we'd have had it already, but we can't turn back time. So we do need legislation and primarily what we need legislation for is to transfer the ability to procure and manage passenger service contracts from what has to happen in the DFT today. Legislatively, there is no option today other than that, and allow what's now been termed Great British Railways, that guiding mind we talked about, to manage passenger service contracts, but also Network Rail will fold into GBR as well, as will some smaller agencies such as RDG, so that we do that. So first of all, we need legislation. But there are some elements that we can progress without legislation. Fares ticketing retail reform is probably the single biggest one of those, which is really about both simplifying fares so that they're more understandable for customers. It's really about trust, and so that customers can trust that when they go onto a system to buy fares, they're getting the right value for money fare for their journey. I don't think anybody could possibly argue we have a system that isn't confusing today.
It's completely difficult, even for people who know a bit about the railways. Like
exactly
me.
That.
So how can you do that without legislation? Why haven't you done it already if it can be done without legislation?
Sure. So the building blocks are there for that. So in the Spending Review 2021, the Chancellor set aside funding for that programme, the Fares Ticketing Retail Reform Programme, and actually the first steps on that will come with some of the things that Mark announced. So Pay As You Go will be extended in Southern region. So we're beginning the journey on that. And of course, in order to introduce Pay As You Go, you need to simplify the fare structure, because that is an enabler to all of that. So we are beginning, the work in the background, this quiet work has started, and we hope to start actually customers out there seeing a difference on that in the coming year as we go forward. Of course, plenty of decision makers have to be persuaded in the interim. We need decisions from Treasury, we need decisions from DFT, and we've got to work with colleagues in train operating companies, work with colleagues in perhaps regional combined authorities such as Manchester and Birmingham as two examples in particular. But that we are hoping that passengers will begin to see some of that work during the course of this coming the calendar year that we're in.
But if you don't get the legislation, will GBR be created, or can it only be created if there is legislation?
So I think there's two aspects that are important to this part, Christian. So first of all, formally, GBR cannot be stood up without legislation. It will be a function of legislative output. But I think what's just as important in the short term, before we have that legislation, is a very clear intent from government, and just as Mark did at the Bradshaw Institute, very clear intent that is the direction we're heading in. You will be painfully aware, and clearly my team and we were even more painfully aware during the hiatus of the kind of Boris time, when actually we didn't know. And because we didn't know, others didn't know whether that was the intent, and that became. We all saw the news articles in the trade press about it's all over. So we with that intent that's the direction of travel. Actually, we can begin to get the industry together. We can begin to start acting and effectively trying our best. So, for example, we can produce. A system P&L for any particular route, and
profit and loss account. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
That's all right.
Which is a way of manifesting and showing the system as one, and therefore the impact of the decisions across that system. That mechanic doesn't exist today. Nobody looks at that even today. So
no, at the moment, as I understand it, the revenue goes to the Treasury. And the costs are borne by the train operators and ultimately by the Department for Transport. Is that correct?
Yeah, broadly, yes. And therein lies another opportunity that we can begin without legislation, which is for the private sector operators to start having a bit of reason to operate as we know the private sector. We could have a long political discussion about whether it's good or bad, but today we have private sector operators and they're not being incentivized to do what private sector operators don't do. The NRC contracts and national rail contracts, which are the current passenger service contracts, have the mechanism. We can start putting a bit of reward back into those contracts for good delivery. We can incentivize around revenue. We can incentivize around cost, and then you are engaging that private sector and the expertise that sits in those organisations to do better, to grow revenue, to cut costs in a sensible way. Which isn't happening at the moment. And again, legislation isn't required for that. The contracts don't need to change. The contents of what's in those contracts, how we utilise the existing mechanisms, is what needs to change.
So just to go back a second, yes, I've got in front of me an article which appeared in Rail Review, the kind of quarterly magazine, which is titled "Scrap GB&R and Concentrate on Reform." And I remember Lord Henry at one point was just talking about reform and no longer talking about GBR. But you seem to have survived that, and certainly I wrote an article saying GBR is dead, but clearly it isn't. Was there actually a hiatus when it might have been that there was going to be no GBR?
Yeah, no, absolutely there was, because it was a policy. The Williams-Shapps is a white paper of government, and when there isn't, when big government is in the position it was in during that hiatus after Boris Johnson's position, then the Theresa May, and then finally the Rishi Sunak. We were
not quite Liz Truss.
Liz Truss, sorry, yeah.
Yes. It's difficult to keep track sometimes.
Indeed,
yes.
Indeed, and there's me proving it as well.
Yes.
But yes, we were absolutely in hiatus. Mark also, when he came in, he was very clear that he wasn't just going to take this policy of his predecessor and apply it blindly. He absolutely took his time. I can tell you he wanted to understand not so much, first of all, what we were doing, but why we were doing it and why what we were suggesting was the right thing. I have to actually commend Mark about how hard he looked at it. And I think what that then, though, meant was when he was convinced it was the right thing to do, he absolutely then was very vocal about it at Bradshaw. And of course, that's the second SOS that we've been through with this journey. When Chris came in, he was in a very similar position that this was all mumbo jumbo, wasn't required. Was it really the thing that? Sorry, not Chris. When Shapps came in, when Grant came in, and again, after going through the conversation, the thought process, and putting together what wasn't working to why this was the right answer, this is the third time. So originally Chris, then Grant, then Mark, where we've been able to show that this is the right, this is a reasonable course of action, and that other options haven't been put on the table that could achieve the same thing. So confident Mark's behind it, confident we've got the right thing, but there is no doubt there was a hiatus in the middle of that, which was comfortable.
That's very interesting. Now, I am slightly, as you know, I've been a slight skeptic of some aspects of rail privatization for a long time. But, I'm all in favour of getting the railways sorted out and together. But I'm still slightly confused about the role of the private sector, because clearly franchising is dead. You're not going to go back to a system where you hand over all the revenue risk. And indeed, given the volatility of the market, I don't think any private sector organisation would take it on at the moment. Okay, so if you're not going to do revenue risk, are you going to go back to sort of some mild incentives for, they're not even called train operating companies anymore. I suppose they're just called train operators. But for the train operators to boost revenue or whatever, how's that going to work? I mean, is there really scope for a strong role for the private sector, or is it going to be fairly light?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is it is a very, very clear policy decision that the private sector operators will continue to be in the role. That's a very clear policy statement from government. and therefore, our role is to create the right instruments that deliver the best of that outcome. So a couple of things. First of all, what we can't describe is a single model that will work across the country, because that would be entirely repeating the mistakes of the past. In some parts of the country where there is revenue growth opportunities, where you have stable railways, there is an opportunity to put a bit of incentive around revenue, both in terms of growth and protection. And indeed, I think it would be true of almost every position, every contract. There would be an element of revenue incentive and incentive on growth. A very wise individual who's been in the industry for a long time, was, as we were doing some early work, was very keen to remind us, well, if you don't ask the private sector to care about money, then they won't. And if they're not caring about the money, then revenue won't grow. So there will be other aspects of those contracts as well, in terms of customer satisfaction, in terms of how they have to work with other parts of industry to really create that position. Now, there will be parts of the country who will be in the opposite situation, where we've got an incredibly unstable environment. So, for example, you can imagine, as HS2 is being delivered on the West Coast, there's quite an unstable environment for the traditional network, and therefore we might find it difficult to find private sector organisations willing to take on revenue risk or revenue incentive in that unstable environment. So we'll have to create the contracts in the right way, working with private sectors organisations who are willing to bid, and create environments where they're willing to bid it. But it's very clear, current policy statement is that there will be private sector operators, so we've got to deliver a contract structure
throughout. You can't imagine, maybe Northern franchise being taken, or contract rather, being taken over by, I don't know, a group of local authorities, or we have a situation in Mersey Rail, for example, where at the moment, it's the sort of combination of the local authorities,
sure,
combined authority, which operates the franchise, and it doesn't quite take on the revenue risk, but it isn't quite the same situation. So can you imagine that it might not all be private sector? There might be some public sector players, or is there really a notion that all these contracts will be given to private sector?
So in England, it's very clear government policy is that it will be private sector. So even those that are in the public sector through the directly operated railways mechanic, eventually the view is, now clearly, if policy changes, then that might change. But in England, very clear policy position, government policy position is we go for private sectors. Now, of course, it's going to take time to get there. You can't procure these things overnight, and indeed you wouldn't want to procure all of them straight away. So I'm not envisaging those that are currently in the public sector through directly operated railways there wouldn't be a wild swing straight towards the private sector on day one of GBR, but the direction of travel is absolutely set and very clear.
But right, you hinted there, you said in England. So in Wales and Scotland, we have different situations, don't we? Let alone Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
But so what might happen there? I mean, they'll still be part of Great British Railways, the name, or is it going to be Great English Railways?
No. So we do see, on the basis that customers travel across the country, cross border, and so on. By keeping that in the heart of what we do need network integrity as well as local integrity. And of course, the answer there is we work with the policymakers in those places to deliver what they want. Scotland is currently being operated effectively in a directly operated way at the moment, ScotRail. Scottish government is currently considering what its policy position on that might be longer term, and similar. The conversation in Wales is slightly different because the whole relationship is in a less mature, developed than Scotland is. Scotland's had its own independence on those views for a while. So there are some bigger policy positions that are really in the macro government kind of space about how those play out. but we've engaged with Scotland. We see how that might work, but actually they've got to get through their next couple of years with ScotRail before they're really clear about what their next steps are beyond that.
Right. Okay. Well. Lastly, Anit, back to the legislation. What is that looking like? I mean, is that sort of part of a big transport bill? Is it likely to happen? You're obviously very keen that it should, but you're also quite sanguine about the fact it might not, and you would still survive. But so when is that likely to be, the legislation, and if it happens?
So look, at this moment in time, no decision has yet been taken. So number 10 is ultimately the arbiter on these kinds of decisions. They're effectively the writers of the King's Speech, and will make that decision. They haven't yet made that decision. There are some policies which they have been very clear on now, which won't go into fourth session. So they have decided on some elements, and so we're still in a bit of limbo on that. Is the honest answer. So how. What does that mean for us? Well, look, we hope for the best. We hope for fourth session legislation, and we're ready for that should that happen. But we also have to plan for that not happening, and being able to take best advantage of the momentum that's been created since Mark has got behind it. And as well as Mark, I should also make a mention of Hugh Merriman, who has also been incredibly supportive of this, and actually with both of them behind it. So we, as I say, we hope for the best, but we also have plans in place that should that not happen, that we can make the best of the momentum that they have created, and ultimately get us into a place where not quite as good as with legislation, but where we can start making decisions across the system for the system. But undeniably, that task is made a lot easier if we can get legislation through in fourth session. In terms of timelines, we will know the answer to that question. Ultimately, we know when the King stands up and does his speech post the summer recess, the parliamentary recess. But actually, I think as a consequence of the way things generally work, we will know the answer to that question before the recess. At least, we'll have a very good indication of where that's going, because broadly those decisions get made before Parliament breaks. So we stay
the next few weeks, basically.
Yeah.
Yes. And without asking you to give away state secrets, it sounds as if the legislation is kind of ready. You're kind of ready to slot it in.
Yeah. So look, the colleagues at DFT who, and this absolutely sits in the world of kind of civil service and DFT. The legislation is written. It will clearly be subject to the normal parliamentary process. So as it goes through the houses, it may get amended, but it's written and is ready to go should the decision be made. Right.
Well, let's end it on that. That's very helpful for Anit, and I can't thank you enough for going out. I'm sure our listeners will be very interested to hear what happens, and good luck over the next few weeks. You're obviously in for an exciting time. Thank you very much.
Exciting is one word for it, Christian. Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Pleasure.
Christian, I think we learned a lot from your interview with Anit. What were the standout points for you?
Well, I think there's two things, actually. One is what a struggle they had in order to ensure that Great British Railways stayed on track once there was the new, as it were, government of Rishi Sunak. There was clearly quite some worries about it, and it's maybe quite a tribute to Anit and his work that it survived. And secondly, there is another struggle going on at the moment, which is over the legislation. And I think reading between the lines of what he said, it's actually essential for the idea indeed to survive, that they have legislation. But, he did sound somewhat cautious about whether they could do, and he was quite optimistic about the fact they could do some things without it. But, it's been a bit stalled. There haven't been many kind of really developments of the work of the transition team. And I really think that unless they get the legislation through, we might not see many changes to the rail network until after the next general election.
And I think as we record this podcast today on Friday, the 5th of May, we're already seeing the fallout from the results of the English local elections, which have shown some very significant losses for the ruling Conservative Party in the UK, as the UK government, and that could cause reprioritization of legislation for the forthcoming King's Speech, and whether
absolutely, because is this a vote winner? Is creating this new organisation going to win any votes? And I've written about that in my forthcoming rail column, and I somewhat suspect that it's not going to be top of the agenda in the houses of Swindon or Blackpool or whatever other marginal seats they need to hold on to. So I think they will try other things. So my bet would be that there's about a 25% chance of there being any legislation.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, I'm not one often to celebrate the royals and whatever, not usually kind of something I go on about, but it was very pleasing to see Prince William and Kate on the Elizabeth line. It was a kind of tribute really to his grandmother in a way, but also it's a tribute to the success of the line, which is sometimes seeing kind of 500,000-600,000 people a day, kind of I think it's 1 in 5 journeys on the rail network is on the Elizabeth line, and there's no stories of it's breaking down. It's about to kind of expand to its full service, although sadly there's not going to be trains between Shenfield and Reading apparently. But otherwise, it has been an amazing success. And it does show that if you invest in urban transport and you really set a 21st century standard, you make it kind of really something that people want to use, then they will flock to it. And indeed, if you want to know more about the history of it and the background to it, you can read my book, The Crossrail Story, which I updated for publication in time for its opening last year. And it's a story showing warts and all about the Crossrail scheme, now the Elizabeth line, and all the problems with it. But now they're forgotten, and people think it's a great success.
Calling All Stations with Christian Wolmar is a Cogitamus Limited production. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.